In December of 1985, a man was kidnapped and his mind was altered to block the memories of what was happening to him. But later, he did remember. Just his thoughts didn't make any sense. He recalled being taken to a germ-infested place and then being operated on by demons. Hello, and welcome to Rope. If you've been with us for any length of time, well, then you know that all we do here is search for the things that society says just can't happen, and then we share our research with you. Some people believe that they've been with us since the very beginning of time, and they hide just outside of human comprehension in a higher spiritual realm, or perhaps another dimension. They've deeply rooted themselves into all government bodies, and they've been at the very heart of every nefarious organization. They have written the narrative, and they have kept humanity in the dark as to the true nature of reality. And many say that they're after our very souls. The Hindus call them Rakshasa. The ancient Mesopotamians called them Lamashtu. Islam refers to them as the Shaitan, or the evil jinn. And the Christians call them demons. The belief in demons has been around longer than there's been writing. They can be found in the earliest literature and the oldest paintings. And although they've been deeply woven into human history, modern society says that, well, they were just fabrications that emerged in the primitive brain during earlier, more nomadic times. And today, especially in Western culture, many people are reluctant to even discuss the possibility that they exist. It is interesting to note, however, that just about the same time that science was putting the idea of demons to rest and placing them into the same category as superstitions and folklore, a new entity emerged on the world stage, one that science and self-proclaimed logical thinkers could bite into. According to Merriam-Webster, the word extraterrestrial as a noun was first used in the 1950s to describe beings from another planet who, up until that point in history, had been non-existent. And interestingly, just like with demons, these creatures are strange in appearance with spindly limbs, long bony fingers, and large, dark, ominous eyes. Now, to be fair, and to come back down to reality, most people do not believe that aliens are just demons in disguise. If anything, the demons of old just might have been misunderstood extraterrestrials. Nevertheless, a fair percentage of the population believe that aliens are just a trick of the devil. They say that the core to reality is spiritual, not physical, and that the world is a place where souls are sent to find out if they're going to do good and believe in God, or if they're going to be fooled by the powers of darkness. These people believe that the world is currently in its very final stages of existence, and that aliens are just the end part of an ancient, well-thought-out, devious plan to convince as many souls as possible that there is no God. In this video, we're going to consider the possibility that aliens just might be something more than what we've come to believe. And we'll do this by following the story of Whitley Strieber. Whitley Strieber is a very famous author who has written over 40 books. And then one day, he decided that he was going to share his experiences with beings that he only refers to as the visitors. We'll follow Strieber's story as he tells it in his book, Communion. Now, at times, you might feel like I'm telling this story in a hard-to-follow, disjointed way, and if that's the case, please know that I'm just sharing this with you as he experienced it, and it's kind of meant to feel that way, at least at first. But I promise you, if you stick with me, it'll all come together at the end of the report. His nightmares began when he was just 12 years old, and they culminate with a horrific encounter nearly 30 years later with a female entity who he speculates has been on Earth interacting with humans for thousands of years. And then stay with us for our fact or fiction section. I'm going to spend just a minute and share some exciting news about our channel. And then Amy is going to come on and she's going to share some interesting similarities that she found between alien abductions and demonic encounters. And when we get there, you just might be surprised at how similar they are. So, this story begins in a cross-country journey in the sleeper car of a train. It was a beautiful, warm few days in July of 1957 as a train traveled from Wisconsin to Texas. 12-year-old Whitley Strieber was an intelligent, good-looking young man. He was traveling home with his father and sister after visiting relatives. Whitley's father had rented a large sleeper car for the family, and Whitley thought that traveling through the countryside was just fantastic. The train made its way through areas of the world that most other transportation couldn't go. It went through everything from wide open meadows to thick, dense forests. Whitley loved watching the countryside as it passed. Then, one afternoon, as he was watching the landscape race by, he saw a wolf just beyond the tracks at the edge of the tree line. It was an extremely beautiful and strong-looking wolf, and he could not stop looking at it. His head turned and his focus intensified as the train rolled by. There was something extremely compelling about that wolf, something that he couldn't quite put his finger on. But what was it? The wolf's head turned as well as it followed Whitley, keeping its eyes focused on his. But then, suddenly, it was gone. Not only the wolf, but the forest around it, and then the train. And the next thing that Whitley knew, he was paralyzed, and he was sitting in a chair, and something was being done to him. Or wait, was he? No, he wasn't. He was peacefully gazing across the beautiful desert, and there was a giant triangle in the distance. It was floating in a beautiful, bright blue sky. Years later, he said that as he remembered that, he also remembered that he was flooded with an onslaught of information.
I was filled with a glut of symbolic material. It was so intense that even as I describe it, I can feel how it hurt my whole brain and body to take it all in. I don't remember what this was. Triangles? Rushing pyramids? Animals leaping through the air?
Whitley's mind kept being flooded with this information, and then, a minute later, he was back on the train. Or wait, was he? He saw his sister lying beside him. She was asleep, but oddly, there were also a bunch of soldiers there as well, and they were all lying on tables. But that wouldn't make any sense. How would they all fit on this sleeper car? Whitley struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. And then, in the midst of all this mental chaos, Whitley spotted a woman moving among the soldiers. and she instantly stood out. She was completely different than anything he had experienced so far. More real, perhaps. Whitley could tell immediately that she was extremely intelligent and very old, ancient even. And there was some sort of connection between her and Whitley. But what was it? She looked at Whitley, and she looked hideous. She was definitely not human, and Whitley looked away instantly. She was most probably evil. Then suddenly, the scene changed, and the woman was gone, and his father was there, and his father was just a few feet away, and he looked like he was experiencing something like electric shock. His eyes were wide, his head was back, and his body was tense and convulsing. Then, even though he couldn't see her, he felt the presence of that hideous woman again. But then no, there was no woman. There were no soldiers, and there was nothing strange or out of the ordinary at all. Well, except for that wolf at the edge of the forest. Whitley had never stopped looking at that wolf, and as it faded into the distance, so did the memory of whatever this was that had just happened. Whitley would not recall these disconnected memories until many years later, and when he did, he would find them extremely disturbing. But they would pale in comparison to what he'd experienced the next time he met the visitors. It was the last week of August in 1967, and Whitley, now attending the University of Texas, had just moved into a studio apartment off campus. At this point in his life, he was upbeat, happy, and positive. He was getting good grades, and he had a clear vision for his future. Being a bachelor and attending college in the late 60s, his diet mostly consisted of snacks, junk food, and TV dinners. And it was a TV dinner that would kick off this nightmare. The day after he moved in, Whitley heated up a TV dinner, took it to the couch, and sat down. Later, he said that he remembered the TV dinner being hot on his lap. But then suddenly, it was on the coffee table. Whitley said he just sat there for a moment, trying to puzzle out what had just happened as his pulse rate jumped about 40 beats. How did the TV dinner just vanish from his lap and appear on the coffee table? It didn't make any sense. After taking a second to collect himself, he reached forward, grabbed the dinner, and found that it was cold, which of course was another shock because just a second earlier, it was steaming hot. He carried the TV dinner back to the oven, and along the way, he tried to come up with any logical explanation for what was happening. And when he got to the oven, he saw that it was 2 p.m. 2 hours had passed, and he had no memory of what had happened during that time. He took this, however, as good news, because he reasoned that, well, he must have fallen asleep and he just didn't remember setting the TV dinner on the coffee table. So, breathing a sigh of relief, he put the TV dinner back into the oven, and then he set a timer for 15 minutes. But then, almost immediately, his mouth went completely dry, and he looked up at the clock. Somehow, it was just past 6 p.m. 4 hours had went by in a flash. This was extremely troubling, but still trying to keep his mind from getting the best of him, he puzzled that, for some reason, he must be suffering from blackouts, and he needed medical attention. So he grabbed the phone to call emergency services, but then, in less than an instant, 6 more hours passed, and all of a sudden, it was midnight, and his mouth was now so dry it felt like it was on fire, and he realized why. Because of these blackouts, he hadn't been able to get any water for the last 12 hours. So, dehydrated, weak, and terrified, he began to shake uncontrollably. But unfortunately for Whitley, his situation was only going to get worse. A second after looking at the clock and seeing that it was midnight, Whitley blacked out again. And when he came to, the clock read 4:15 a.m. And now he was standing at the sink and he had a full glass of water in his hand, which he quickly consumed. But even while he was doing so, the only thing that he wanted to do was to get out of that apartment. So the moment that that glass was empty, he grabbed his keys and his wallet and he made a mad dash for his car. Once he got to his car, there was another blackout. But shortly after that, he was scarfing down food at a nearby restaurant. And after getting rehydrated and his fill of food, he was able to calm himself down enough to begin to puzzle out what had just happened. And he thought about going to the hospital, but he was feeling much better now and he did not want to look crazy. So he just continued to recollect himself and eventually he went home and went to sleep. But just like with the incident that had happened 10 years earlier on the train, there was more to these experiences than just blackouts. Something had taken place during those moments. But what? Most of those blackouts would remain a mystery, but one would be revealed. A few weeks later, while he was at his grandmother's house, an image in a magazine would trigger something in his mind, and he would remember what had happened during the blackout at his car. The memory would be so demonic and so nightmarish that he would be forced to rethink the very nature of reality. During a break in school curriculum, Whitley went to visit his grandmother in San Antonio. He took the spare bedroom, which was right across from hers. One evening, while he was lying awake in bed and reading Time magazine, he heard a faint buzzing coming from somewhere in the house. At first, it wasn't very loud, so he just ignored it and he kept reading. But then at one point, he turned the page and he saw an ad for a Ford Mustang. Well, he owned a Ford Mustang, and for some reason, the ad captivated him. And while he stared at it, he felt a puzzle piece begin to unlock in his mind. But when that happened, strangely, the buzzing got louder.
I turned the page and there's an ad for a car. For some reason, I just kept staring at that ad and the buzzing around me got louder and louder. Somehow, part of me knew what the buzzing was, but part of me didn't. And suddenly, I saw this very fierce face that looked like a giant fly next to my bed. And all of a sudden it slammed something onto my head. Something like a shiny silver nail or a railroad spike.
At the very moment that that giant demented fly slammed that nail into his head, Whitley's consciousness split. Part of him was back at his apartment a few weeks earlier, and he was standing at the sink again with that full glass of water. He instantly knew he was experiencing a memory, but it felt extremely real. But because it was a memory, he had no control over his actions, and he could only watch the events as they played out.
I was suddenly transported back in time to Austin a few weeks earlier. I leaped into my car and backed out of the apartment parking lot. It was night, and the windows of the car were closed. Suddenly, the windows became mirrored, and I couldn't see anything but the reflection of the inside of the car. So I was forced to stop. Somehow I could tell that something approached the car. I was frightened to see, peering in the window with its face pressed almost to the glass, what seemed almost to be a demon with a narrow face and dark, slanted eyes. And it spoke to me in a high, squeaky voice.
"We're coming for you."
Now, remember, this whole time, Whitley is still at his grandmother's house. This is just a memory of what had happened weeks earlier at his apartment.
I found myself in an agonizing struggle. Part of me was in the car trying to drive away, but at the same time, for some reason, I also had a powerful urge to get out of the car and go back into the apartment. And while I was struggling with that, I also felt myself in the real world at Grandma's. And for some reason, I had an overwhelming urge to get out of bed and rush outside.
It may be a bit confusing, but during this time, he was still at his grandmother's, and what he was experiencing was only a memory. But the memory was so strong, he had no idea what was happening to his person in the real world, and that was terrifying. For years afterward, he would struggle trying to crack that memory. And then one day, in the mid-80s, he would have a breakthrough, and he would remember part of what had happened, and it was horrifying. The visitors had actually transformed him into something dark, heavy, and hideous. For years, Whitley couldn't remember anything that took place during that blackout at his grandmother's. But finally, one day, he did remember. And this is what he said happened.
The giant, fierce-looking fly hit me right on the side of the head with a big, flat-headed silver nail. And instantly, my mind was transported back to weeks earlier. But at the exact same time at my grandmother's house, as soon as the fly hit me, I turned into something else. And I became heavy and big. It was terrifying. I turned into another kind of thing, a big, heavy, dark, bony thing. As this thing, I got up out of bed and started moving through the house. I was like a ghost moving through my grandmother's house.
Whitley said that at one point he was in the basement, and at other times he was at other places in the house. He said that as he moved through the house, he felt disconnected from the physical, like he was a ghost. He didn't remember much else. He didn't remember what he did as that strange, dark, bony thing, nor did he remember any more about the night that he saw that demonic creature just outside of his car. But by this point in his life, he knew that there was something happening out of the ordinary, but he didn't have a clue of what to do about it. Who do you tell? So he just filed it into the back of his mind and he went on. Time passed, and eventually he got married, and although small anomalies gave him pause every once in a while, nothing happened that was even close to the events that he experienced at his grandmother's house and at his apartment. He did, however, have an impossible experience with the stereo, and this time, someone else, his wife, experienced it too.
One evening in April 1977, something so bizarre happened that I still cannot understand why we didn't make more of it. With both of us sitting together in our living room, somebody suddenly started speaking to us through the stereo. The voice held a brief conversation with us. It was perfectly clear. Not like the sort of garbled message sometimes picked up from a passing taxi's radio or a ham operator. Nothing like it had ever happened before, and it never happened again. Strangely, I don't remember the conversation, except for the last words. The voice said, "I know something else about you."
I know something else about you. Louis Whitley Strieber was born in San Antonio, Texas on Wednesday, June 13th, 1945. He grew up with an insatiable appetite for knowledge. He loved to read. And it was apparent very early on that he was highly intelligent with a lot of productive energy. He graduated from the University of Texas and then went on to the London School of Film Technique. He worked in New York until 1977, where he launched his career as a full-time author, eventually becoming very successful with over 40 books published, most of which were fiction. He kept his personal life out of the spotlight, and he never shared his experiences with the entities that he eventually began to call the visitors. And for the first 40 years of his life, much of his interactions with these creatures was cloaked in darkness and didn't make any sense. He finally discovered that whenever they would take him, or abduct him, if you will, they would replace the experience of whatever they did to him with what he ended up calling a screen memory. These screen memories went all the way back to that time that he thought he saw that wolf on that train when he was 12 years old, and actually a little before that. Having his memories robbed like that and being kept in the dark as to what was really happening to him was extremely frightening, and it was frustrating. It was all disconnected and confusing, and as the years went on, the hope of trying to make any sense of it began to fade until he wondered if he would ever be able to understand any of it at all. But that would change the day after Christmas, 1985, when he would finally come face to face and remember the entity that had been behind this whole thing the entire time. In December of 1985, Whitley took his wife and his son, who was around 8 years old, to the family's cabin for Christmas. The cabin was located in upstate New York. It was quite a ways off of the main highway, and it was only accessible by a dirt road. Christmas had been picture perfect. Snow had been falling, and the family sat in the living room next to the fireplace, exchanging gifts. The next morning, December 26th, was beautiful. The day was bright, the sky was blue, and in the morning, Whitley took his son out and they broke in his son's new sled. Later that afternoon, he and his wife went cross-country skiing. And the couple returned home by 8:30. They were in bed by 10 and asleep by 11. The night was cold and snow was coming down. There was 8 inches on the ground before the couple fell asleep. Then, sometime during the night, Whitley woke up to a strange whooshing and swirling noise that was coming from the living room downstairs. He immediately shot up and he looked over at the alarm panel. It showed that the windows and the doors had not been breached, and the swirling and swishing sound was gone. So, apprehensive but slightly reassured, he sank back down into his bed and he was just about to close his eyes when he saw one of the double doors leading into his room begin to move.
I remember thinking, what could be moving the door? Then suddenly I saw the outline of a compact figure bending around it. I was too stunned to move and I simply sat there staring. I could see perhaps a third of this figure that was entering the room and the part that was bending around the door. I had the feeling that whatever it was looking directly at me. In the dark, it appeared to be wearing a smooth, rounded hat with an odd, sharp rim that jutted out easily 4 inches on the sides. Below this was a vague area. It continued to move the door, and eventually it was in the room, coming toward me. A few minutes later, when it was close to the bed, I saw 2 dark holes for eyes and a black, downturning line of a mouth that later became an O.
Whitley later said that by this point, he believed that these beings had already taken over part of his thinking process, and they were trying to confuse him and give him screen memories because the erroneous idea that this was just a dream had popped into his head. But this time, for the most part, he was able to stay in control of most of his thinking.
Next thing I knew, the figure rushed into the room and, like lightning, crossed the distance from the door to the bed, got right up in my face, and then everything went black. My next conscious recollection was of being in motion. I was naked, with my arms and legs extended as if I'd been frozen in mid-leap. I was moving out of the room. There was no physical sensation at all, not of being touched, not of being warm, nor cold. I could feel myself as a shape and a mass, but not in terms of sensation. It was as if I'd become profoundly paralyzed. Although I desperately wanted to move, I couldn't. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in a small sort of depression in the woods. It was quite dark, and frozen ivy was pressing tightly all around me. I remember being puzzled that, there was no snow on this area of the ground.
Whitley was still naked, but he didn't feel the cold. As a matter of fact, he said that he was still lacking all physical touch sensation. He sat in this depression, and on the surface, it appeared that he was completely alone, just sitting there in the woods. But he knew that that wasn't the case. He said that if he didn't look straight at it, he could see that there was something, an individual to his left. He said that the person was wearing a gray tan bodysuit and sitting on the ground with knees drawn up and hands clasped around them in a nonchalant way. He said the face was terrifying. Again, not being able to make anything out except from the corner of his eye, he could see 2 dark eye holes and a round mouth hole, and gave him the impression that the person was wearing a mask.
I felt that I was under the exact and detailed control of whomever had me. Although I was not tied, I could not move my head or my hands or any part of my body except for my eyes. Immediately on my right was another figure. This one was completely invisible except for an occasional flash of movement. This person was moving super fast and working busily at something that seemed to have to do with the right side of my head. The individual to my left made a clear impression. I don't know why, but I had the distinct feeling that this was a woman. She appeared almost bored or indifferent. I also felt she was explaining something to me, but I can't remember what it was.
Shortly after this, Whitley floated upward, and he entered a structure that was just above the tree line. And on the inside, he said it was like a circular chamber with a grayish tan ceiling. And interestingly, he didn't say that he entered a flying saucer. Instead, he said that he felt like he was in someone's filthy living space.
Across the room to my right, some clothing was thrown on the floor. It felt as if the place was actually dirty. The room was small, tight, and enclosed. It was confining, stuffy, and the air was dry.
Now, this is where things get intense and finally start to make some sense. Tiny beings were buzzing all around him at a great speed. As a matter of fact, they were moving so fast that it was a shock to his system and very disturbing. Oddly, he said that there was something ugly about the way that they moved. He thinks they did something to his eyes, or maybe his consciousness, because he was only able to see things at a glance. Whenever he tried to focus in on anything, it quickly became a blur. He wasn't able to tell how long he was kept in this room, but after a few moments, a tiny gray box was brought in front of him, and for some reason, he was able to focus on it without it becoming a blur. And then, everything and everyone just stopped for a moment, and he was allowed to gaze upon this box for a bit. And it was at that point that he noticed that the box was actually being held by that female entity that he had experienced in the woods just a few minutes earlier. And as she held this box in front of his face, he had the distinct impression that she was ancient. And a second later, he heard himself say, "You know what I think?
You know what I think?
I think that you are very old."
I think you're very old.
And she said, "Yes,
Yes,
I am very old."
I am very old.
At some point later, he would remember that it was she who was the female entity that he had experienced during that episode when he was 12 years old on that train. And as a matter of fact, in one way or another, it appeared that she may have been behind every one of the terrifying experiences that he had went through from the very, very beginning. And later, check this out. After a bit of research, Whitley came to the conclusion that this being just might have been the very same being that's written about in ancient Mesopotamian literature, the Anunnaki goddess of lust and war, Ishtar. If there's any truth to that at all, it gives me chills, and it gives a whole new feeling to the idea of alien abductions. After allowing him to look at this box for a moment, another being came up and slid it open, and inside was a tiny, shiny needle.
The needle glittered when I saw it out of the corner of my eye, but was practically invisible straight on. Somehow she made me aware that they were going to insert this into my brain. I was afraid already, but now I became quite simply crazed with terror. I argued with them, I'm saying, "This place is filthy. You'll turn me into a vegetable."
Realizing what they were about to do, he just started screaming uncontrollably, and they weren't able to get back into his mind to give him a screen memory or to calm him down, so he just kept screaming. And the female said that he needed to calm down, and he did not listen. He was just unconsolable. And finally she asked him, she said, "What can I do to help you relax?"
My reply was unexpected. I heard myself say, "You could let me smell you." At the time, I didn't know why I asked that, but it made a great deal of sense as I've afterward realized that the female said okay and brought her face, close to mine, while another was cradling the back of my head with his hand. The odor was very distinct and gave me exactly what I needed, an anchor in reality. It remained the most convincing part of the whole memory because that odor was completely indistinguishable from a real one. It didn't seem in any way a dream experience or a hallucination. I remembered it as an actual smell.
The smell did not help Whitley calm down, and he remembered arguing with her, saying that she did not have the right to do this, to which she replied and said, "Oh yes, we most certainly do have the right to do this."
The next thing I knew, there was a bang and a bash, and I realized that they'd performed the proposed operation on my head.
At this point, Whitley got some sensation back and a tiny bit of mobility. He remembered sinking down into his seat and trying to steady himself with his feet. Then, as he was still reeling from this explosion that had just went off in his head, they put their hands all over him and they picked him up and they moved him into another room.
My memories of movement from place to place, really, they're the hardest to recall because it was then that I felt the most helpless. My fear would rise when they touched me. Their hands were soft, kind of even soothing, but there were so many of them that it felt as if I was being passed along by rows of insects. It was very distressing.
In this new area, they performed all types of procedures on him. They inserted things into his body. They cut open his skin. They seemed to be collecting samples. Parts of this experience made him feel like he was being tortured. Other parts made him feel like he was being raped. Finally, one of the beings stabbed something sharp into his finger, and the very next thing that he knew, he was back in his cabin, sitting on his couch. Before we get into the ins and outs of this report, I have to say that Amy and I are jazzed. As of the moment of this filming, our seventh report on this channel, Men in Black, has received over 308,000 views. And for us, that's just insane. Now, for those of you who haven't watched it, be warned. I am truly embarrassed by my commentary in that video. There was a lot of things going on in our lives when we created that report, and I did not realize that I overused the phrase, check this out. I must have used that phrase at least 5 trillion times in that video. We've actually received hundreds of comments from people saying that our channel is just a joke because we use that phrase, and they will never watch another one of our reports again. So keep that in mind if you decide to check out that video. As far as this video goes, Whitley Strieber is convinced that there's a lot more to this alien phenomenon than the world thinks. After sharing his story, he said, quote, "The whole experience does seem like alien contact, at least on one level. But that's only one level, and this very complex reality has many levels. Understanding it is going to be one of the greatest challenges in the history of the human mind. It's going to take deep, careful thought and a willingness to explore into areas of strangeness that are far beyond what we now believe to be possible." Now, please don't misunderstand this report. We are not saying that Whitley emphatically believes that demons are the beings that people generally think of as extraterrestrials. But he doesn't close the door to that either. And as a matter of fact, he says that there's definitely more to these beings than what most people think. And referring to these visitors, he does say, and I quote, "There's a significant part of the natural world and our own presence in it that we do not yet understand as part of objective reality, but rather only in terms of stories of gods, angels, demons, ghosts, and so forth." This report was extremely interesting to me because I grew up in a very religious environment, and while Amy was sharing the details of it with me, I could easily see some similarities between Whitley's abductions and what the church taught me was demonic possessions. As far as evidences supporting Whitley's claims, well, there's actually quite a bit. But as with most reports of this type, it's all anecdotal and it comes only from eyewitnesses. But Whitley's girlfriend heard the voice come over the stereo as well as Whitley did. And Whitley's son later said that he too experienced a supernatural event while they were at that cabin during that Christmas in 1985. Some of Whitley's friends also said that while they were with Whitley, they too experienced some supernatural events. And what I thought was particularly interesting was, as far as him writing a book about his experiences, well, he alludes to the fact that his publisher did not like the idea at all and speculated that if Whitley did so, it just might mean the end of his career. But he went ahead and published it anyway. Personally, I would not risk my career on a hoax. So, if nothing else, that's evidence, at least to me, that Whitley has strong convictions that these events actually happened. Some of this information was so intriguing to me that I asked Amy to see what similarities she could find between demonic encounters and alien abductions. And to share what she came up with, here's Amy.
Hey, lover. First, let me say, check this out. I think you did a great job with the Men in Black report, and don't let the haters get to you.
Thank you. I love you.
I love you too. And as far as the similarities between alien abductions and demonic encounters, I didn't have to look far. A quick Google search shows there are a lot of people who believe that aliens are actually demons in disguise. And some of them pose a scenario that I found extremely interesting. They all basically go like this. Imagine a scene where a man senses a presence in his room late at night, when suddenly a figure appears right next to him. The man is terrified and tries to scream, but he's paralyzed. The figure then takes the man to another place. The man experiences telepathic communication. He is tortured, prodded, probed, often sexually. Eventually, the man wakes up with strange marks and is confused. Now, what would you say is behind that? It's just as valid to say that it's a demonic encounter as it is to say it's an alien abduction.
Right. So someone, say in the 1800s or maybe earlier, would say that that was an encounter with a demon, for sure. But someone today might say it's an abduction by an alien.
Right. I found several charts on the internet where people have compared the similarities between alien abductions and demonic possessions. This one links 12 similarities.
Okay, so how does it stack up against Whitley's experiences?
Well, here it talks about entities appearing at night in a person's bedroom. Whitley reported quite a few of these instances, like the encounters on the train, in the sleeper room, in his studio apartment, in his room at his grandmother's, and in his room at his cabin.
Right.
Another is communicating mentally. Whitley shares many instances where the visitors communicated in his mind. And finally, periods of unconsciousness. Whitley's entire life was filled with blackouts.
So, after doing this research, what do you think?
I think there are definitely strong similarities. I also think that demonic possessions and alien abductions are both fringe subjects, and as a whole, we know very little about either one. So I would have to say that I think some abductions could actually be possessions, but definitely not all. It's an area that needs a lot more study.
Okay. Wow. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So, what do you think? Is there more to alien abduction phenomenon than what most people believe? And if so, could aliens actually be demons? You know, this report reminds me of the experience that the Platt family say that they went through. Theirs wasn't an alien encounter, but it was demonic. They believed that they were the victims of a powerful demonic force. Their nightmare began when the youngest daughter, Heather, received a homemade gift for her 6th birthday. Shortly after that, Heather started to withdraw from the family, and she spent less and less time with her siblings and more time with her gift. Then, Her voice began to change. It became deeper, more masculine, and at times the family said that she would speak without even opening her mouth. The story is bone-chilling, and the entire family swore that it actually took place. We did a complete report on it, and if you'd like to see it, it's here. I'll start it, okay? Well, as I said before, I guess that ties it up for another episode here at Rope.
Goodbye.
Thank you.